is how we do it.
Alright, so before we talk about how to train your hamstrings, we first need to understand a few things about this muscle group. The hamstrings are actually composed of three distinct muscles: the semitendinosus, the semimembranosus, and the biceps femoris. The hamstrings are a biarticular muscle, meaning that they cross two joints, the hip and the knee, and they collectively have two actions, with number one being knee flexion and number two being hip extension. We use this to inform how we train them in the gym by loading both knee flexion and hip extension. It's important to include both of those movement patterns for the most complete hamstring growth in your program, because part of the biceps femoris muscle does not actually cross the hip joint and can therefore only be trained using knee flexion movements. So let's get into what you would actually do in the gym, starting with what is the king of hamstring builders in my opinion, which is the RDL, or the stiff-legged deadlift. It doesn't really matter which of these names you use or what you call it. It just matters how you actually perform the exercise. And that is going to be how you see me doing it here, with a neutral spine, knees close to full lockout, pulling the bar tight against your legs, doing a proper brace, and being sure to hinge at the hip as you slowly descend and push your butt back. This movement trains the hip extension function of the hamstrings, and what's really great about it is that it places the hamstrings under a super deep stretch, since the knee is extended and the hip is flexed. Not only does it allow the hamstrings to enter into their fully lengthened position, but it also provides the most joint torque, or in other words, the most resistance at the hip joint in that stretch position. This is because the bar is furthest away horizontally from my hip joint in that bottom position. So I point all of this out to say that there is a difference between simply entering into the lengthened position during an exercise and having that exercise provide the most resistance in that lengthened position. So the RDL checks all of the boxes for being a super great hamstring exercise. My personal recommendation is to do these in the 5 to 10 rep range, because otherwise your cardiorespiratory system will become the limiting factor rather than your glutes and hamstrings, which is not what you want. I mentioned earlier that one part of the hamstring only acts on the knee joint. That part is the short head of the biceps femoris. So we're going to have to include a leg curl variation in order to train that part of the muscle. You could include either a laying hamstring curl or a seated hamstring curl, with the main difference between the two being the degree of stretch being placed on the parts of the hamstring that cross the hip joint. You can see that when I'm laying, my upper leg and torso form almost a straight line, whereas when I'm sitting, the angle between my upper leg and torso is much smaller. So the seated hamstring curl may be a little bit better since it places a greater stretch on the hamstrings, but at the end of the day, both are great options. I currently have both of these variations in my program, but you can choose whichever one you prefer. You could do just one, or you could do both. Doesn't really matter. These exercises that I mentioned aren't the only great options either. There are plenty of other variations that you can implement, like Nordic hamstring curls, hyperextensions, and so on. Just be sure that you include both knee flexion and hip extension when writing your program. As always, use good technique, push hard, train close to failure, and add sets, reps, load, or some combination thereof over the course of many weeks and months, and you're on your way to having those sweet and juicy hamstrings.